range of factors. I mean, as you know, longer-term interest rates in New Zealand are determined as much by global developments as they are by local monetary policy expectations. So the answer to that question will depend as much on where global interest rates go as what we do.
Would you like to see the yield curve be a bit more positive and therefore get back to, I suppose, a normal situation?
Well, it's certainly, as is the case in other countries, when shorter-term interest rates are lower than longer-term interest rates, then that's generally where most borrowers will tend to borrow. And if that's the case, then certainly it makes our transmission mechanism that much quicker. But monetary policy deals with a number of long and variable lags, and it's just part of the landscape that we deal with.
Could you talk in a bit more depth about where you'd like to see the banks pass on the wholesale rates to customers, both retail and consumers and business? Because there is some suggestion that the banks have passed on more of their cuts to consumers than they have to businesses.
Well, that's a hard one to judge because, as you know, there's such a range of different rates going out to businesses. No, it's hard. It's difficult to do that, and indeed, I don't think it's our role to do that. Banks will decide themselves based on competitive conditions, as well as the official cash rate, as well as their other funds raising costs, how they're going to configure that. As you know, there's a lot of difference about the way they position themselves around the yield curves. And we're not trying to be prescriptive about that, where our comment is a generalised one that we do want and expect to see these rates being passed through. We're aware that a lot of the previous ones were, but prior to that there was a build-up in margins.
Dr. Bollard, in October you expressed the view that the prospect of a global meltdown on the banking system was low, which seems to me a slightly Pollyannish view of the world, but do you still hold with that view?
Well, I don't think that's exactly my words, Simon, but in general we have been surprised by the continuation of financial market turmoil. We think probably October was the worst month we've seen to date, and as I said, we are seeing those coming through onto the real economies, and you're now seeing that in recession or near recession in most of the G7.
So how stable do you assess the global banking system to be at the moment?
Well, the global banking system is one that has incrementally had more and more support from the public sector. So basically the public sector has been taking on board loss and risk from the private sector, judging how that's working, finding there's still problems, putting more and more in, moving from liquidity support through a range of credit supports into capital support. The public sector can do that. It really means you end up with a financial system that is quite constrained and can't continue to grow in the same sort of way, and is going to be extremely risk averse and may have to go through consolidation and reorganisation. But the financial system will continue like in that form. I might use that moment to say also that our view of the New Zealand banking system is that it remains sound, and there is little change there. There is liquidity there. It is continuing to lend, and both the New Zealand and Australian systems continue to look sound to us. Any further questions? Bernard.
Do you have a view on quantitative easing and whether the Reserve Bank here would ever need to get into that sort of area that other Reserve Banks are having to think about right now?
Well, we've been doing a lot of technical measures around liquidity support, and those have generally been in the area of making it easier for banks to bring in different sorts of security, and us accepting those as security and putting in more through the system. We're still looking further at what could be done there to ensure that that doesn't just stop at the banking system but is able to be passed on to corporates like that. You're aware of the guarantees. These are unconventional instruments. We've been in a situation where we can observe and watch what's been happening at really the front of the battle lines, which of course are in the United States and Europe on these matters. And at the minute, we've not seen reason or need to go beyond that. Sorry, just hold on.
Sorry, because in theory you could use the TAF to quantitatively ease and not mop up liquidity.
There's other things that could be done. If you want to discuss that at some stage, get in touch with Mike Hanna and he'll talk to you.
Dr. Bollard, a former Deputy Governor, Roderick Dean, said that there's some distortions being caused because of the guarantees, and there's been difficulty for corporates to access bonds and so on. Your Deputy Governor now, Grant Spencer, said that the bank has been looking at that as an issue and there may be some more measures ahead. Can you update us on that?
Well, I mean, yes, absolutely. The guarantee scheme is distortionary. We always knew it would be. It's distortionary around two boundary areas. One is what's a financial institution and what's not, and that's the corporate issue. It's also been distortionary around what's a deposit and what's not. That's been the investment funds issue. Those we knew would happen. New Zealand was in a situation that had little alternative but to announce that scheme when it did. In my view, from hindsight, it's been the right thing. But yes, it absolutely has caused distortions. When there's global turmoil, people get hurt in all of this. To try and we have been trying to alleviate some of that. You'll see some of the subsequent measures and different pricing we've put in place. On that particular issue, yeah, we are looking at whether there's further things that can be done. They're limited, but there's some possibilities. No, we will. Well, in broad terms, it's a question of whether we can make corporate paper more acceptable and therefore more liquid. It's quite technical, and again, ring Mike Hanna.
You remarked before that you've been watching what's been happening on the battle lines in the States in particular. Obviously, they just put $800 billion in, and that seemed to be in frustration at a lot of the previous things they'd done not quite flowing through. You then remarked also that you still have some confidence that the financial system is... I mean, what gives you that confidence? There's obviously the situation's deteriorating.
Well, we have a vanilla banking system in New Zealand. It's well run as a whole. It hasn't taken on bad debts as a whole. And in addition, mortgage holders in New Zealand stand behind those. They don't walk away from them, as happens in some states in the United States. In addition, we don't have a big investment banking sector in New Zealand, which is also where some of these problems have arisen. So